Yeah, I think Putin is sending a signal that he's killing Ukrainians, but also he is killing Russians. Ukrainian people, many of them are thinking coming back for a while, but the motivation is not that because it is safe there. Motivation is to help, to do something. It's really unfortunate that current leadership around the world is not sufficiently experienced in dealing with Putin. I think eventually the support will get through, but the US politics right now is truly unpredictable.
Hello and welcome to Connected. I'm Divya Gopalan. On February 24th, the war in Ukraine will enter its third year. Now, when Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, it became the largest attack on a European country since World War II. At the time, Russia's President Vladimir Putin had expected to take control of its much smaller neighbor within days. But 2 years on, with a quarter of the country displaced and tens of thousands of people killed or injured, the brutal push and pull for territory continues. Now, in June 2022, Russian troops occupied around 20% of Ukrainian territory. Fast forward to November last year, and the US-based Institute for the Study of War pared that down to around 18% of Ukraine's territory, with Ukrainian forces liberating some Russian-controlled areas. But many fear the tide has turned again, as Ukraine may be facing the toughest chapter of its war since the first days of Russia's invasion. And to understand where the conflict is heading, we are joined by Dr. Tymofiy Mylovanov. He's the president of the Kyiv School of Economics, who is currently traveling in Pittsburgh, USA. He's also the former Minister of Economic Development, Trade and Agriculture of Ukraine. Thank you very much for being part of the program today. I want to first ask you, did you expect the war to enter a third year?
Not in the beginning, but I didn't expect it to be over soon. But I think sometime in the first half of the year, I realized that it's going to be a long war. Yeah, I just didn't believe the war would happen, the full-scale invasion. I mean, we have the war since 2014, since the annexation of Crimea and invasion in the east of Ukraine. But at this scale, I just didn't think it would happen. But once it happened, it took me a couple of months to realize, but now I think it's going to be a long war.
If we look at what's happening on the ground here, and one of the biggest developments is that Russia now says it's completed its takeover of the eastern city of Avdiika. Now, that was considered to be Russia's first battlefield success in 9 months. Can you explain the significance of this in the larger context of the conflict?
Well, I would say it's not that they have captured Avdiika, that they have destroyed it completely. There's nothing left in Avdiika. It's literally nothing. They're just ruins of houses, and videos show that. But yes, the significance of this is it's not a big actually area. It's 12 square miles, so it's very, very small. And it took 9 months to take it. But it does open up an opportunity to move forward on Kramatorsk and Slavyansk, which are bigger cities, populated by people. And those would have strategic significance. And we're already seeing that they use artillery, rockets to attack them. There were attacks today. So they're intensifying attacks on those cities.
How much would you say the front lines have changed since the start of the war?
They have changed a lot in the beginning, in the first several weeks and then months. Then there was battle for Kyiv, and Ukraine pushed back Russia all the way from the north and northeast of Ukraine. And then in another half a year, Ukraine has managed to take back Kherson, which is south, and Kharkiv, which is east, a little bit to the northeast. And then Russia started pushing back. Ukraine launched a counteroffensive in the summer, but it produced some gains. But not much, partly because the counteroffensive was delayed in expectations and deliveries of better weapons, and it gave Russians an opportunity to dig in.
Right, and I want to talk about the issue of getting those weapons a bit later in the program. But before we go to that, according to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, The decision to surrender Avdiika was made in order to save lives. Now, neither side gives death tolls for the war, but in December last year, U.S. officials reportedly put Ukrainian casualties at close to 190,000. And according to a declassified U.S. intelligence report, nearly 315,000 Russians are dead or injured. Now, again, I need to stress that it is difficult to get accurate numbers, with Moscow underreporting figures and Ukraine also reluctant to bear the extent of the devastation. Let's go back to support within Ukraine. Now, Ukraine has been struggling with recruitment, and what has been key in this battle is the Ukrainians' fighting spirit. How concerned are you that morale is waning?
Well, there are unverified videos circulating on social networks, Russian social networks and media, and now everywhere, of them executing in Avdiivka prisoners of war, especially wounded and unarmed prisoners of war. Well, they're unarmed once they're prisoners. In cold blood, they're basically shooting them, and there are multiple videos like that. They're pretty disturbing, and so that, of course, has a negative effect on morale. It creates a sense of grim determination. And what's interesting about this is that one of the episodes is relatively well documented, and Ukrainian unit retreated from that part of Avdiivka, but they had wounded soldiers, and 5 wounded soldiers were left, with one non-wounded soldier with them. And they had an agreement with Russians, so they reached out to Russians and said, okay, we have wounded, we are going to surrender. That was negotiated. Once the Russians came, they just shot them. So they reneged on the agreements. And that actually why Ukrainians do not believe that Russia could be trusted with negotiations, because they've been doing it in 2014, 2016. In 2016, for example, there was a big battle where Ukrainians were surrounded, and then 300 officers were given a green corridor to leave the surrounding area in exchange for dropping weapons. Once they dropped the weapons, Russians just attacked and killed them. So, you know, it's a recurrent theme. So in that sense, the morale, of course, is affected, but it becomes this very grim, very down-to-earth, very personal desire to defend and survive, actually.
And if we move away from those who are fighting and the civilians and people who are trying to continue with their daily lives in Ukraine, do you expect more of an exodus out of Ukraine? We talk about the number of people displaced there, a quarter of the country. So do you expect more people to leave the country? And what is the feeling amongst the people of Ukraine? Is there still a sense that they want this fight to continue?
Well, of course, we don't have a choice. And these are not words. I mean, they might sound like a very simplistic words, but it's not words, because we know what Russians do to occupied territories. So, you know, talk to people. I've traveled to the occupied territories. I've met with elderly who are 70 or 80 years old, who were kept in basically containment, you know, half a meter, square meter per person, and many of them died and some survived. And it's just because Russians didn't care. They treated them as cattle, you know. So, you know, it just, there's not much of a choice. Now, males are not allowed to leave the country. Women, females are, but I think at this point, the expectation of migration is at zero. Some people actually coming back because they want. I'll be back in I think in 2 weeks, but I'm traveling often for fundraising and discussions, especially in the United States. But Ukrainian people, refugees I talk to here and in Europe, many of them are thinking coming back for a while. But the motivation is not that because it is safe there. The motivation is to help, to do something. They feel some of them feel a need to connect with Ukraine, and some of them feel guilty that they're, not doing enough. But I think a lot of them are doing many more than in normal circumstances people would do. So I think there's this determination. Now, this is frankly a very difficult, dark time for Ukraine. It's this third winter. And the first year was the harshest, the most difficult. Then 2023 was better, but this year is going to be very difficult for Ukraine.
You brought up the fundraising. Let's go back to the U.S., where a $60 billion aid package has been approved by Congress, but it is currently held up by the Republicans. From where you are in the U.S. and what you're hearing, how likely is it that that package can be released? And has the focus in Washington moved away from Ukraine?
Partly. It's not the same situation when it was in the beginning. And of course, there are competing priorities. And the main one is actually not Israel or Gaza, but the main one is elections. And it becomes pretty dysfunctional, pretty polarized, pretty toxic environment. And I think the United States is a democracy, is a developed democracy, century-long democracy, but it's struggling right now. The discourse, the discussions are very, very uninformed, very simplistic. It's very emotional. Many people, many voters become disillusioned or jaded or frustrated or cynical. And when people become cynical, democracy can die. I think the U.S. doesn't have that threat, and the U.S. will recover. And it has to go through this process, but it has its own problems, its own challenges. And it's very cutthroat competition. And actually, the voter bases for both parties are pretty dissatisfied, both with their opponents and with their own candidates. So it's a very toxic, very poisonous environment. In that environment, Ukraine support and other support and other important policy decisions have become basically, hijacked. They're victim of this politics. Now, you asked me a question if how likely the support to get through the bill. Well, everyone is saying that the votes are there, but procedurally to get it to the floor is difficult. So at this point, I think, frankly, people are not, people are neutral about this. I think sometime in January, mid-January, people were optimistic, but that by February 1st, maybe February 15th, there would be support. But at this point, no one would be willing to make a prediction. I think the votes are there, but will there be a possibility to get through? I think eventually the support will get through. So that's my sense. But the U.S. politics right now is truly unpredictable.
Truly, truly unpredictable. And you brought up elections, and Donald Trump, as we know, is running for re-election, and it's one of the key Republican tickets. He says he'll end the war within 24 hours if he returns to the White House. He hasn't made it clear of how that's going to happen. How seriously is Kyiv taking this, and are they preparing for an eventuality where they could lose U.S. support?
Well, the U.S. will never say that the support is, there will be no support. The U.S. will delay the support. And we are in the environment in which this support has been delayed significantly, that it has a meaningful material effect on the battlefield and on lives lost. So what Ukraine is doing is cutting down expenditures outside of military and improving its own production and working with other allies against the background of hopefully getting the U.S. aid later. So, Germany has made much bigger commitments than otherwise, up to $15 billion. France and the UK are stepping up with $5 and $3 billion, respectively. That's coming from the Munich conference, time announcements. And so, the question is, does the European coalition have enough capacity to replace the U.S. support, or at least temporarily? It's a really, really big question, but it does appear that Europe is as worried about reliability of the foreign policy and consistency of the foreign policy of the United States, and they are mobilizing and they taking it very, very seriously. And of course, Ukraine and Central Europe and the EU and the European countries, the incentives are aligned. The national security threats are for everyone. Because if Ukraine falls, or Ukraine doesn't come out reasonably victorious, or in some sense, it has to come out a successful country. But basically, if politically Putin gets his way, that is going to have two profound implications for the region, and then therefore global implications. One, it will undermine credibility of the United States, and the credibility of the United States has already been challenged by previous foreign policy and military engagements in the last decades. So it's going to make it even more difficult for the U.S. foreign policy to be credible. So whoever will be the president in the future and in the future after that, and they will have to rebuild the reputation of the United States, or they will have the challenge of not being as effective in foreign policy than otherwise. And the second one is that the security and trust and expectation of growth or peaceful development in Europe will be shattered. Whatever happens with Ukraine, if Putin is not stopped, people in Europe will be worried and will be expecting some other developments, be it maybe in Georgia or some hybrid developments, even with NATO countries, undermining the countries from inside, using cyber, using political divisions, and these processes will just amplify and grow. So these are serious implications, and unfortunately, right now it looks like the democracies are not mobilized enough, but they are trying.
Right, and given that, how much, with the, as you said, with Europe's security at stake in this, how much political will is there to supply Ukraine with the weapons it needs? Because at the heart of all of this is the need for Ukraine to have the weapons to fight the Russians and the kind of weapons it needs. So how much political will is there to help them with that? And what is it that Ukraine really needs right now?
Well, the irony is that, the U.S. has the capacity, has the industry, but it is facing political disagreements. Whereas Europe, especially Central Europe, has a lot of political will, but doesn't have the same level of industrial capacity the United States have. So this is the problem here. What exactly Ukraine needs? Containment, deterrence weapons. It has to be able to stop Russia, and it also requires. Combat is not just the front line. It's supplies, it's logistics, it's bases. Ideally, you want to destroy weapons of the enemy before they come to the front lines, so you don't engage. You're not being hammered at them, and then. So for that, we need longer range weapons, and there, in fact, political will could be a little bit constrained.
All right, so let's take a look at what's happening within Russia. US and other world leaders have expressed outrage at the death of Vladimir Putin's biggest critic, the opposition leader Alexei Navalny. Now, he died in an Arctic penal colony where he had been transferred during his imprisonment by the Kremlin. He was serving a 30-plus year sentence there. So in response to this, Washington is set to announce a major set of sanctions against Moscow. What do you think that's likely to entail, and what difference do you think that's likely to make?
Well, there, of course, will be some sanctions, and they will be probably targeted on some companies and individuals. But, Timothy Ash recently, an analyst, financial analyst from London, has written that there are, a very simple set of sanctions, confiscate Russian assets and give them to Ukraine to pay for weapons, isolate trade with Russia, and designate Russia as a terrorist state. This is all within the power. It requires some legal work. It requires some political will. but these are sanctions, and I think I'm very, I'm very frustrated by now, and I have seen how timid these sanctions are. It's a little bit like with weapons; they are often too late and too little, and so I don't expect any major sanctions to happen this Friday. I very much hope I'm wrong.
Right. What is the view from Kyiv on what's happening in Moscow? Is there a sense that Putin is getting even more emboldened and could go further with an aggressive push?
Yeah, I think Putin is sending a signal that he's killing Ukrainians, but also he is killing Russians. And he's killing Russians on two fronts. One, he's killing opposition or defectors or whoever dares to kind of raise a voice against him. And then he's killing his own military, people who, sends in tens of thousands at Ukrainians. So there is that sense that he's gradually moving towards a pretty awful, pretty authoritarian regime in which the value of life is basically zero. And I think it's a consequence of insufficient response from the United States in particular, but also from the rest of the world towards his aggression. He basically checked that the quote-unquote devastating consequences of sanctions or whatever else would be a response for the invasion in Ukraine or for war crimes or for other things like killing Navalny. They are limited, and so he's learning he can do that. I think it's really unfortunate that current leadership around the world is not sufficiently experienced in dealing with Putin and a little bit, hopeful, or there's a little bit of wishful thinking that somehow this situation will go away. It won't. Putin will have to be deposed one way or another. Eventually, he will die. But he's not going to stop until then. He might die by natural causes, but for the remainder of his life, he will be increasing the level of aggression of Russia in the region.
Okay, and if we move back to what's going on in Ukraine, one of the key strengths of Ukraine was its solidarity, both of the people and within its government. But we've seen major shakeups and major changes. And despite President Zelensky's efforts to crack down on corruption, we're still seeing scandals surface. What has been the impact of this? And is there a sense that there might be a fracturing within the government?
There has been fracturing, maybe not within the government, but between a part of leadership of military and the government. In particular, this dynamic dispute about the policy disagreements between the commander-in-chief and president. And that has been resolved, and there have been fears that this disagreement will create some kind of political upheaval or some kind of maybe even pushback, protests, but that has not happened. And I think it's a sign of a relatively mature democracy which can overcome its own problems during the wartime. And it also is a sign of a democracy that there are disagreements and they become public, because it's in the authoritarian regimes disagreements end up in being a coup, like between Prigozhin and Putin, but there's no public discussion before that. So to me, there's one negative aspect of this is that unfortunately there are these disagreements, and I wish people were more united. But on the other hand, I think it's natural and it's healthy to have that in democracy, and it's also good that the legitimately elected civil leaders have the upper hand. So that's on the disagreement. Now, on the corruption, I think it's just what we are seeing is that the prosecutions becoming more aggressive. Any prosecution can be interpreted, oh, that's another sign of corruption, or it could be a sign of fighting corruption. And it requires careful analysis. I think Ukraine has demonstrated that in certain areas it has been able to remove corruption, for example, in central banking or in civilian procurement of the state. But there are pockets, and exactly, I think this is the case in point, in fact, that the corruption scandals are happening in the areas of the procurement which have not been reformed. And the kind of positive sign is that these areas are being reformed. It's painful, it's difficult to do during the war, but it's not just prosecutions, it's also structural reforms on the way we do corruption in those areas which were not as transparent before. So I think that has to be finished. That has to be done. I would have been, as a minister, I used to be a minister, would have been much more aggressive on those structural reforms. But again, I'm a hawk.
Right. I want to change tack a little bit here. We're running out of time. But as you know, Taiwan's been watching this conflict very, very carefully and has also expressed support for Ukraine. And one of the key reasons for that is it's got this large aggressive neighbor next door, which is China. What do you think Taiwan's key takeaway should be from Ukraine's experience?
Democracies, especially the US currently, might have inconsistent policies and they have diminishing credibility. So that has to be taken into account. And how do you mitigate for that? By building your own industry, which can help you with national security, of course, but also by building broader coalitions with a lot of allies. So, the coalitions have to grow. The support has it's not enough to focus on one, or two, or three, or five key countries. That's not enough. You have to have really very large coalitions. So while some of the members of this coalition are experiencing domestic issues, domestic political issues, others are stepping in. And also one interesting thing is that the UK has been a very, very steadfast in its support. So I think that's also is a good something worth taking a note of.
I'm afraid we're running out of time, but I feel we'll barely scratch the surface of this discussion. Tymofiy Mylovanov, president of the Kyiv School of Economics, thank you so much for being part of our discussion today. And for our viewers everywhere, it has been good to have your company. Thank you for watching. If you would like to be part of the conversation, you can head over to our social media channels. Remember, stay informed, stay engaged, and stay connected.